One of the philosophies from classical antiquity that became very popular in the Renaissance was the philosophy of humanism. And essentially, this idea and this outlook is, in its very basic definition, just an emphasis on man, especially what people can accomplish using their capable minds and their wonderful bodies. So this is something that was really fundamental for understanding classical antiquity. But it was something that was lost as we moved into the Middle Ages, and it begins to reemerge as we move up to the Renaissance. It influences Renaissance in a couple of different ways. First, it influences just the societal outlooks of the time. We get what we call the cult of deeds, or the cult of fame, that emerges at this point in time. And the cult of deeds and the cult of fame, you can kind of use those interchangeably. Sometimes the cult of fame is the more popular phrase to use. Essentially, the idea that comes from classical antiquity that reemerges during the Renaissance is that why should people feel insignificant? We should celebrate the accomplishments of man. We should celebrate people for what they do that's wonderful by giving them fame. Okay, so fame was very important in the classical world, and it begins to be so again in the early Renaissance. Now, this directly correlates to the status of artists during this time period too, because initially, the beginnings of the Renaissance, artists were just kind of seen as just someone else that works with their hands. But because we start to see a recognition of human accomplishment through fame, we start to see a recognition of artists also through fame. So we start to see this whole kind of emphasis on the artist. And this begins in the early Renaissance. It's not going to be fully fledged until we get to the high Renaissance. But by the time we get to that point, because artists had done so many wonderful things and because they were celebrated for those things that they accomplished, we really start to see that in the high Renaissance, artists are equated essentially with geniuses and even with God. They call them godlike creators because artists create things just as God had created things. And this is the period when we really start to see that whole idea of a Renaissance man emerge. We have in the high Renaissance especially, these artists who are incredibly capable and incredibly talented and incredibly educated in all sorts of subjects. And not only do they do all of these subjects, they do them all well. So that's just beginning in the early Renaissance and leading us up into the high Renaissance. One of the best examples of that is an early Renaissance artist named Battista Alberti. He himself was an individual who was highly impacted by humanistic ideas, and he himself is also an example of how artists became known and were awarded fame for the accomplishments that they did. So Alberti was one who really pushed for this whole notion of seeing artists as intellectuals and not just as craftsmen. And he was, here in his self-portrait, you can see him showing himself just as though he is a ruler from classical antiquity in a profile portrait on a coin. That's really what this looks like. He was really influential in a lot of ways. One of the things that he does to exert this kind of influence and spread these ideas of humanism is he writes a number of texts about art. And in those texts and treatises, he begins a lot of times with some vernacular translations from classical texts. So one of the things that he translates from classical antiquity are the books on architecture by Vitruvius. And when he does these classical translations, or even when he's writing something that's his own thoughts, he's really interspersing everything with a lot of humanistic kinds of ideas. He writes a lot about art. He writes a lot about architecture, how it was done in the classical past. And then he also writes how it should be done now that they are in, the present, in his present time. So he comes up with these kinds of ideas about what art should do and how art should be. They're very much influenced by what had been done in classical antiquity. One of the things he says in his text is he says that some subjects are better than others, and we call this the hierarchy of genres. Essentially, he says that the best kind of subject matter to portray would be history painting. Okay, so history painting is a genre of subjects in art, and history painting encompasses not only moments in history, as the name suggests, but also biblical subject matter, and mythological subject matter. And he felt like this was the best because this was a place where you could really exert a lot of creative genius as an artist. Okay, he also said, building on some things that Plato had said earlier in classical antiquity, that art should be a window on the world. So what does he mean by this? When he says art should be a window on the world, he really just means it should look believable, it should look naturalistic. And that's something that classical antiquity definitely emphasized as well when it came to art. Okay, another thing that he talks about in some of these writings on art is he really kind of revives that idea of portraiture. We already looked at his self-portrait. He was one who felt that we could commemorate people who had accomplished wonderful things by doing a portrait. And we'll see that those portraits become really influential in early Renaissance art. Okay, so we've set up just the basic definition of humanism. We've talked about how it kind of impacted society at large in the Renaissance through the cult of fame and how that impacted the status of artists. And the other thing we just want to kind of explain is to talk about how humanism then started to impact art itself. So there's a few things that we're going to emphasize in our class. In art, we start to see, because of humanism, an emphasis on the human body. Okay, that seems pretty obvious. We get a lot of emphasis not only on just showing the human body, but showing it in particular ways. So in the nude, right? Let's show the body. It's something that's beautiful. It's something that should be celebrated. That was definitely something that was lost in the Middle Ages and something that is revived in the Renaissance. And if you're going to show the body in the nude, you should show it accurately, right? So there's also an emphasis on anatomy and proportion and making those look believable. Along with that, there's an emphasis on believable poses. One of the things that they start to revive in the Renaissance that was done as well in classical antiquity would be Contrapposto, and we'll talk about that in a moment. They also start to revive human emotions, feeling that the human experience is something that's important to document in art, and of course portraits, right? People deserve to be remembered. That's kind of the idea behind that. So when we look at Masaccio's work here, The Expulsion of Adam and Eve, you can see a couple of things that show humanism right off the bat. First of all, two figures in the nude, two figures that have fairly accurate proportions, fairly accurate anatomy, that have some hints of musculature, and also their poses are fairly believable. So all of that shows humanism. If we look at the faces here, you can see that Adam and Eve are really devastated to be kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and that emphasis on human emotions is another indication of the humanism of the era. When we look at this work by Perugino, you can see again an emphasis on nudity and anatomy. This is a good example of contrapposto. Contrapposto is essentially just like a weight shift, a counterbalance that your body does when you kind of stand in a normal position. So usually when we're just standing, we bend one leg, so our hip on that side of our body gets closer to the ground. And then of course, because our hips have shifted, our shoulders have to do a counter shift to balance that posture out. That's essentially contrapposto. The other thing that we see then, as we mentioned, are portraits. Here, when we look at Ghirlandaio's portrait of Giovanna Tornabuoni, you can see that there was an emphasis on capturing people, their physical likenesses, as a way to kind of memorialize them and commemorate them. So those are the basics about humanism, what it meant for just Italian society at large, and how we see that impacting art.